Control your mind before fear takes hold of you. There is a moment, quiet and almost invisible, where everything begins to fall apart. Not outside, inside you. Nothing has happened yet. No real threat, no concrete danger. And still, your chest tightens, your thoughts accelerate, and something deep within you starts whispering that something is wrong. But what exactly is wrong? That is the question most people never stop to ask, because the feeling arrives before the logic has time to respond. Fear does not arrive like a storm crashing into your life. It does not announce itself with noise or warning. It seeps in like a thought you barely notice, a subtle shift in perception, a small interpretation that goes unquestioned. And from that moment on, your mind begins to build a version of reality that feels convincing, but is not real. You are no longer responding to what is actually happening. You are responding to what your mind is suggesting might happen. And this is where the real danger begins. Most people believe they are dealing with life as it is, but in truth, they are reacting to an internal narrative that was never verified. The mind becomes a storyteller, and fear becomes the main character in a story that keeps rewriting itself with every new thought. The more attention you give it, the more detailed it becomes, until it feels indistinguishable from reality. You start to feel consequences of things that have not occurred. Your body reacts, your emotions shift, your decisions change, all based on something that exists only in your interpretation. And the longer this process goes unnoticed, the stronger it becomes. What started as a thought becomes a belief. What was once a possibility becomes, in your mind, an inevitability. But here is the turning point that most people never reach. If fear is something constructed internally, then it is also something that can be interrupted internally. That changes everything, because it means you are not powerless. It means the control you thought you lost was never actually taken from you. It was handed over, slowly, thought by thought. The moment you begin to see how your mind converts uncertainty into threat, you create a break in the pattern. You step outside the automatic reaction. You stop being carried by the current and begin to observe it. And that observation alone starts to weaken the entire structure fear depends on. Once you see it clearly, you cannot go back to not seeing it. You begin to notice the patterns, the triggers, the subtle ways your mind leads you into emotional traps. And with that awareness comes a question that is impossible to ignore. If fear can grow from something so small, so silent, so unnoticed, when exactly does it begin? The moment your mind begins to betray you. It never starts with panic. It never starts with something obvious that you can immediately identify and reject. It begins with a thought that feels completely reasonable, a small doubt, a quiet internal question that sounds intelligent, even protective. And that is exactly why it passes through your mind without resistance. You are about to take a step forward, make a decision, or enter something unfamiliar, and suddenly your mind introduces a possibility. What if this does not work? What if something goes wrong? At first, it feels like awareness, like preparation, like you're being cautious and responsible. But in reality, something much deeper is happening beneath the surface. That single thought does not stay alone. Your mind begins to build around it. It starts gathering fragments from your past, pulling memories that support uncertainty, recalling moments of failure, exaggerating risks, and quietly ignoring anything that contradicts the narrative. What was once a neutral situation is now being filtered through a lens of doubt. The betrayal is not aggressive, it is subtle and persuasive. Your mind does not force you into fear. It convinces you step by step. Each thought leads to another, each one slightly more intense than the last, until the emotional response begins to rise. And by the time you feel it in your body, it already feels real, justified, and almost impossible to question. This is the exact point where most people lose control, and they do not even realize it. They do not question the origin of the thought. They accept it. They follow it. They allow it to guide their focus, and whatever you focus on begins to expand. The imagined scenario gains detail, emotion, and weight, until it feels like something you must respond to immediately. But here is where everything can change. The moment you recognize that not every thought is a command, not every thought is truth, and not every thought deserves your attention, you interrupt the process. You create distance between you and what your mind is presenting. And that distance is where control begins. You start to observe instead of react. You begin to see the thought as a suggestion, not a fact. And in doing so, you weaken the emotional chain that follows it. The fear does not disappear instantly, but it loses its authority. It no longer dictates your next move. Your mind does not need to be silenced. It needs to be seen clearly, and once you begin to see it clearly, another layer reveals itself. Something even more deceptive and more powerful. Your mind is not just reacting to what is happening now. It is already moving ahead of you, creating futures that do not exist, and preparing you to fear them. The illusion of anticipation when the future becomes the enemy. Your mind does not wait for reality to unfold. It moves ahead of you, constructing scenarios before you even take your next step. And the more uncertain the situation, the more detailed these scenarios become. What makes this dangerous is not just the imagination itself, but how quickly your brain treats these imagined outcomes as if they are already real. You begin with a simple projection. What if this fails? But your mind does not stop there. It builds consequences, layers possibilities, connects events that have not happened, and suddenly, you are no longer thinking about the future. You are emotionally living inside it. Your body reacts, your focus shifts, your confidence drops, all because of something that has not occurred. This is the illusion of anticipation. It feels like preparation, but it is actually a distortion. You believe you are getting ready for what might happen when in reality, you are surrendering your present clarity to an imagined version of events. The future becomes an enemy, not because it is dangerous, but because your mind has framed it that way. And here is the subtle trap. The more you try to predict outcomes to feel safe, the more you reinforce the idea that something is wrong. Your brain interprets this constant scanning as evidence that there is a threat, so it continues. It searches harder. It imagines worse scenarios. It tightens its grip on your attention. What started as an attempt to gain control becomes the exact reason you lose it. You begin to hesitate. Decisions feel heavier. Actions feel riskier. And over time, you start avoiding situations not because they are truly dangerous, but because your mind has already convinced you that they are. You are no longer responding to life. You are responding to predictions. But the future has no power over you in this moment. It does not exist yet. What exists is your interpretation of it, and that interpretation is being shaped, not by facts, but by unchecked thoughts that have gained momentum. This is where awareness shifts everything. The moment you recognize that anticipation is not reality, you begin to detach from it. You stop treating imagined outcomes as certainty. You return your attention to what is actually in front of you, instead of what your mind is projecting ahead of you. Control is not found in predicting the future. It is found in stabilizing the present. Because when your mind is anchored in what is real, the illusions lose their intensity, the scenarios fade, the urgency dissolves, and something important becomes clear. Fear is not just about what you think might happen. It is about how your mind interprets everything, including what is happening right now. Fear is an internal language, not an external reaction. Fear does not begin in the world. It begins in the way your mind translates the world into meaning. Two people can face the same situation and walk away with completely different emotional experiences. One sees challenge, the other sees threat. The difference is not in reality itself, but in the internal language being used to interpret it. Your mind is constantly labeling, defining, and assigning significance to everything you experience. It does this automatically, without asking for your permission. A situation happens, and within milliseconds, your mind tells you what it means. Safe or dangerous, opportunity or risk, manageable or overwhelming. And once that label is assigned, your emotional response follows immediately. What you call fear is often just the result of a specific interpretation repeated so many times that it feels like truth. The moment something unfamiliar appears, your internal language begins to construct a narrative. This is risky. This could go wrong. You are not ready. And because these phrases sound familiar, you accept them without resistance. This is where the power of fear truly lies. Not in the event, but in the description your mind gives to the event. You are not reacting to reality. You are reacting to the words and meanings your mind attaches to it. And here is what most people never realize. That internal language is not fixed. It is learned, repeated, and reinforced over time, which means it can also be changed. The same situation that once triggered fear can be interpreted differently, not through denial or forced positivity, but through conscious awareness. When you begin to notice the exact words your mind uses, you create distance from them. You stop automatically believing them. You start questioning them. Is this truly dangerous, or is this unfamiliar? Is this failure, or is this feedback? Is this a threat, or is this growth? These questions interrupt the automatic translation process. They slow down the reaction. They give you space to respond instead of react. And in that space, something shifts. The intensity of fear begins to weaken, not because the situation changed, but because the meaning changed. The internal language no longer feeds the same emotional pattern. Your mind will always interpret reality. That is its function. But you are not required to accept every interpretation it offers. And once you begin to see this clearly, you start to notice something even more subtle. It is not only what your mind tells you, it is how it changes what you see altogether. The silent distortion of perception fear does not just influence what you think. It changes what you see, not literally but psychologically. It filters reality, edits details, amplifies risks, and minimizes anything that suggests safety or control. What you are looking at remains the same, but what you perceive becomes something entirely different. You walk into a situation and your mind has already decided what matters. It highlights potential problems, scans for signs of failure, and ignores everything neutral or positive. A single uncertainty becomes the center of your attention, while dozens of stable elements fade into the background. This is not accidental. It is selective perception, guided by fear. And the more you focus on those perceived threats, the more real they become. Your attention feeds them. Your mind reinforces them. You begin to feel surrounded by risk, even when the actual situation has not changed. This creates a feedback loop. You see danger, you feel fear, and that fear makes the danger appear even more prominent. Over time, this distortion becomes your default lens. You stop questioning it. You assume that what you are seeing is accurate, when in reality, it is heavily filtered. The world feels more hostile, more unpredictable, more overwhelming. Not because it is, but because your perception has been trained to highlight instability. This is where many people get trapped. They try to fix the external situation, believing that changing circumstances will remove the fear. But the distortion remains. Even in safer environments, the mind continues to scan, continues to interpret, continues to project risk. The shift begins when you realize that perception is not passive, it is constructed. What you notice, what you focus on, and what you ignore are all influenced by internal patterns. And those patterns can be observed. When you start questioning what you are focusing on, you begin to rebalance your perception. You ask yourself what you might be overlooking. You intentionally widen your awareness. You bring back details that fear pushed aside. This does not eliminate uncertainty. It restores proportion. It allows you to see situations more completely, not just through the narrow lens of threat. And once your perception begins to stabilize, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. It is not just how you see things in the moment. It is how your mind keeps returning to the same kind of thoughts again and again, as if it has learned to prefer them. The invisible addiction to worst-case thinking. At some point, fear stops being a reaction and becomes a habit. Not a conscious choice, but a repeated mental pattern that your brain begins to prefer. You do not just encounter negative thoughts occasionally. You start generating them automatically, almost predictably, as if your mind has learned that this is the safest way to operate. It begins subtly. You think through possibilities, trying to prepare, trying to stay ahead, trying to avoid mistakes. But over time, your mind starts skipping neutral or positive outcomes and goes straight to what could go wrong. Not because it is more accurate, but because it feels more urgent. Worst-case thinking creates a false sense of control. It convinces you that by imagining every possible failure, you are protecting yourself from being surprised. But what it actually does is keep your mind locked in a constant state of tension. You are always bracing, always scanning, always preparing for something that has not happened. And the more you engage with these thoughts, the more familiar they become. Familiarity creates comfort, even when the content itself is uncomfortable. This is where the addiction forms. Your brain begins to associate negative projection with readiness. It feels productive, it feels responsible, but it is neither. Instead of preparing you, it drains you. It reduces your ability to think clearly. It narrows your perspective. It makes opportunities look like risks and challenges look like threats. Over time, it shapes your identity. You start to see yourself as someone who expects things to go wrong. And once that identity forms, it reinforces the pattern. You look for evidence that confirms it. You remember failures more vividly than successes. You interpret uncertainty as danger. The cycle becomes self-sustaining. Breaking this pattern does not require forcing positive thoughts. It requires recognizing the pattern itself. The moment you notice that your mind is defaulting to worst-case scenarios, you interrupt the automatic flow. You question the necessity of the thought. You ask whether it is helping you act or simply keeping you stuck. This awareness weakens the habit. It does not disappear instantly, but it loses its dominance. You begin to create space for other possibilities, not unrealistic ones, but balanced ones. And as this pattern starts to loosen, another behavior becomes clear. It is not just what you think, it is what you avoid doing because of those thoughts. The hidden cost of avoiding discomfort avoidance feels like relief in the moment. You step back, delay a decision, walk away from something that makes you uneasy, and instantly, the tension drops. Your body relaxes, your mind quiets down, and it seems like you made the right choice. But that relief comes with a cost that is not immediately visible. Every time you avoid discomfort, you send a signal to your mind that the situation you escaped was dangerous, even if it was not. Your brain does not analyze the objective reality. It learns from your behavior. If you retreat, it assumes there was something to fear. And because of that, the next time you face a similar situation, the fear will return stronger. What feels like protection is actually reinforcement. You are training your mind to become more sensitive, more reactive, more resistant to uncertainty. Over time, the threshold for discomfort lowers. Situations that once felt manageable now feel overwhelming. Things you used to handle with ease begin to trigger hesitation. This is how your world slowly shrinks without you noticing. Not because opportunities disappear, but because your willingness to face them decreases. You start saying no more often. You delay more decisions. You overthink simple actions. And gradually, your life becomes organized around what you can avoid rather than what you can pursue. The most dangerous part is that this process feels justified. You tell yourself you are being careful, that you are waiting for the right moment, that you are protecting your energy. But underneath those explanations is a pattern of retreat that is quietly shaping your identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who needs to feel ready before acting. Someone who needs certainty before moving forward. And since certainty rarely comes, action becomes rare. Breaking this cycle requires a different relationship with discomfort. Not resistance, not suppression, but acceptance. Discomfort is not a signal to stop. It is a signal that you are stepping into something unfamiliar. And unfamiliar does not mean dangerous. When you start moving toward discomfort in controlled, intentional ways, your mind begins to recalibrate. It learns that tension does not equal threat. It learns that you can handle more than it assumed. And with each small exposure, your confidence builds. Not from thinking differently, but from experiencing differently. Avoidance weakens you slowly. Exposure strengthens you gradually. And as you begin to face what you once avoided, another pattern reveals itself. It is not just your actions that shape your fear. It is the way you speak to yourself while you are in it. The internal dialogue that fuels chaos. There is a voice inside your mind that never stops speaking. Most of the time, you do not even notice it, because it sounds like you. It uses your tone, your language, your memories. It feels familiar, almost trustworthy. But this voice is not always guiding you. Many times it is amplifying the very fear you are trying to escape. When discomfort appears, this internal dialogue becomes more active. It starts interpreting everything in real time. This is too much. You are not ready. This is going to go wrong. You should stop. These phrases are not random. They follow patterns built over time, shaped by past experiences, repeated thoughts, and emotional reactions. The problem is not that these thoughts exist. The problem is that you rarely question them. You hear them, and you accept them as truth. And once accepted, they begin to influence your state. Your body responds, your focus narrows, your confidence drops, all because of words that were never examined. This is how chaos is created internally, not through external pressure, but through constant negative interpretation. Your mind takes a neutral moment and fills it with tension. It takes uncertainty and turns it into threat. And the more this dialogue continues unchecked, the more intense your emotional response becomes. What makes this even more powerful is repetition. The more you repeat a certain way of speaking to yourself, the more automatic it becomes. Eventually, you are not choosing these thoughts. They are choosing themselves. They appear instantly without effort, and they feel like an inseparable part of who you are. But this is where awareness creates a shift. The moment you start listening to your internal dialogue as if it were separate from you, everything changes. You begin to notice patterns. You recognize tone. You identify exaggeration. And most importantly, you realize that this voice is not always accurate. You start asking simple but powerful questions. Is this helping me move forward, or is it holding me back? Is this a fact, or is this fear speaking? Would I say this to someone I care about? These questions disrupt the automatic flow. They introduce space between you and the thought. And in that space, the intensity of the emotion begins to decrease. Not because the situation changed, but because the interpretation changed. You do not need to silence your mind. You need to refine how you relate to it. When your internal dialogue becomes more balanced, more intentional, and less reactive, your emotional state follows. And as that state stabilizes, you begin to notice something critical. Fear does not just affect what you think or say internally. It affects how your entire mind functions under pressure. The fragmentation of the mind under pressure. When fear intensifies, your mind stops operating as a unified system. It begins to fragment. Your attention splits, your thoughts compete, your focus weakens, and what was once clear becomes scattered. You are no longer thinking with direction. You are reacting in pieces. In a calm state, your mind processes information with structure. You can prioritize, analyze, and make decisions with a sense of continuity. But under pressure, that structure breaks down. One part of your mind is trying to move forward. Another is pulling you back. Another is replaying past mistakes. And another is projecting future failure. All of this happens at the same time. This internal conflict creates mental noise. And that noise reduces clarity. You begin to second-guess simple decisions. You hesitate where you would normally act. You overanalyze situations that do not require complexity. The more you try to force control, the more disorganized your thinking becomes. This is not a lack of intelligence. It is a lack of coherence. Your mind is overloaded, not incapable. Fear floods your system with urgency, and urgency demands immediate answers. But when multiple conflicting thoughts are competing for attention, you cannot access clear reasoning. The result is paralysis or impulsive reaction. You either freeze because nothing feels certain, or you act quickly just to escape the discomfort. Both outcomes come from the same source, a fragmented mental state that cannot stabilize itself. What most people do in this moment is try to think harder. They push, analyze more, search for the perfect answer. But this only increases the pressure. It adds more noise to an already overloaded system. The shift happens when you stop trying to solve everything at once. Instead of chasing clarity through more thinking, you create clarity by reducing input. You bring your attention back to a single point, one decision, one action, one step. When your focus narrows intentionally, the fragmentation begins to settle. The competing thoughts lose intensity because they are no longer being fed equally. Your mind starts to reorganize itself around what matters in the present. This does not eliminate fear instantly, but it restores function. It brings back a sense of control, not by removing pressure, but by stabilizing your response to it. And once your mind regains that sense of coherence, something becomes clear. Fear does not have to disappear for you to move forward. What matters is whether you are experiencing fear or being controlled by it. The difference between feeling fear and being controlled by it. Fear is not the problem. It is a natural response built into you for protection, awareness, and survival. The real problem begins when that response takes control of your decisions, your actions, and your direction. There is a critical distinction here that most people never learn to recognize. Feeling fear is an experience. Being controlled by fear is a pattern. You can feel tension, uncertainty, even doubt, and still move forward. That is strength. But when fear dictates your choices, when it decides what you avoid, what you delay, and what you never attempt, it stops being a signal and becomes a barrier. The confusion happens because both states feel similar in the beginning. Your heart races, your thoughts accelerate, your body reacts. But what happens next defines everything. If you pause, observe, and continue despite the discomfort, you remain in control. If you withdraw, hesitate, or change direction solely to escape the feeling, fear takes control. Over time, this distinction shapes your entire life. Every decision becomes a fork in the road. One path leads through discomfort toward growth. The other leads away from discomfort toward temporary relief. And every time you choose relief over growth, the influence of fear expands. You start organizing your life around emotional safety instead of intentional action. You avoid risks, you limit exposure, you reduce challenges. And while this may create short-term comfort, it slowly erodes your confidence. Because confidence is not built by thinking. It is built by acting despite uncertainty. This is why eliminating fear is not the goal. That is neither realistic nor necessary. The goal is to change your relationship with it, to see it as information, not instruction, to feel it without submitting to it. When you begin to separate the sensation from the decision, you create a powerful shift. Fear can exist, but it no longer leads. You regain authority over your actions. You choose based on intention, not reaction. And the more you practice this, the clearer it becomes. Control is not about removing internal resistance. It is about moving with awareness even when resistance is present. But there is a moment, very brief and often unnoticed, where this choice is made. A moment that determines whether fear grows stronger or loses its influence. The point of choice that almost no one notices. There is a moment so brief, so subtle, that most people never realize it exists. It happens between the thought and the reaction, between the feeling and the decision. And in that fraction of time, everything is determined. You feel the surge of fear. Your body responds instantly. Your mind begins to generate explanations, scenarios, justifications. And right there, before you act, before you speak, before you withdraw, there is a gap. Small, almost invisible, but real. Most people never enter that gap consciously. They move from feeling to reaction automatically. The process is so fast, so practiced, that it feels unavoidable. But it is not. It is simply unobserved. That moment is where control either exists or disappears. If you do not recognize it, your reaction will always follow the path of least resistance. You will choose what reduces discomfort in the short term. You will avoid, delay, or retreat. And each time you do, the pattern becomes stronger, faster, more automatic. But if you begin to notice that moment, even for a second, something shifts. You interrupt the automatic sequence. You create space between impulse and action. And in that space, you gain the ability to choose differently. This is not about stopping fear. It is about slowing down your response to it. In that brief pause, You can ask a different question. Not what feels safe, but what is aligned with who you want to become. Not what avoids discomfort, but what moves you forward. And that question redirects your action. At first, this feels unnatural. Your mind will resist it. It will push you toward Pravichnyi patterns, toward immediate relief. But the more you practice noticing that moment, the more accessible it becomes. You begin to catch yourself earlier. You recognize the signals faster. You pause without forcing it. And that pause becomes your point of power. Because control is not something you apply after the reaction. It exists before it. And once you start making different choices in that moment, something deeper begins to change. It is no longer just about individual actions. It is about how you see yourself in relation to fear. The reconstruction of internal trust. At some point, fear stops being about situations and starts being about you. Not trusting the outcome is one thing. Not trusting yourself is something else entirely. And this is where the deeper damage happens. You begin to doubt your ability to handle what comes next. This doubt does not appear suddenly. It is built over time, through repeated moments where you stepped back, avoided, or chose comfort over action. Each of those moments leaves a mark, not visible, but cumulative. And eventually, your mind forms a conclusion. You cannot handle pressure. You are not ready. You are not capable. That conclusion becomes your internal reference point. Every new situation is filtered through it. You do not just evaluate what is happening. You evaluate yourself within it. And if your internal trust is low, everything feels more threatening, more overwhelming, more uncertain. This is why external solutions rarely solve internal fear. You can change environments, reduce risks, prepare more. But if the trust in yourself is not there, the fear returns in a different form. Because the real question is not what will happen. It is whether you believe you can handle it. Rebuilding that trust does not come from thinking differently. It comes from evidence. Real experiences where you act despite discomfort and see that you can endure, adapt, and respond. Not perfectly, but sufficiently. Each time you face something you would normally avoid, you create a new reference. You prove to yourself that your previous assumption was incomplete, that you are more capable than your fear suggested. This process is gradual. There is no instant shift. But with each small action, your internal narrative begins to change. The voice that once said you cannot begins to lose certainty. It becomes quieter, less convincing. You start to rely less on how you feel and more on what you have done. Your confidence becomes grounded in experience, not in the absence of fear. And that changes everything. Because when you trust yourself, uncertainty loses its weight. You no longer need guarantees. You no longer wait for the perfect moment. You move forward knowing that whatever happens, you will deal with it. And as that trust strengthens, you begin to develop something even more powerful. Not just confidence, but control over your emotional state, even when pressure is present. Emotional discipline as a tool of power. Most people think control comes from eliminating emotion, from reaching a state where fear no longer appears. But that is not control. That is avoidance in another form. Real control is the ability to experience emotion without losing direction. Emotional discipline is not suppression. It is regulation. It is the capacity to feel intensity without being driven by it, to stay aligned with your decisions even when your internal state is unstable. When fear rises, your first instinct is to react, to escape the feeling, to reduce the tension, to return to comfort. This is automatic, but discipline interrupts that instinct. It allows you to hold the emotion without immediately acting on it. That is where power is built. Because the moment you can stay present with discomfort without reacting impulsively, you expand your range. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable, not because they changed, but because your response to them changed. Emotional discipline is trained, not inherited. It develops through repetition, through moments where you feel the urge to retreat, but choose to stay, where you feel doubt, but continue anyway, where your mind creates pressure, but you do not collapse under it. At first, this feels difficult. Your system is not used to holding tension without release. But with time, your tolerance increases. What once triggered strong reactions begins to feel familiar, and familiarity reduces intensity. This does not make you insensitive. It makes you stable. You begin to operate with a different kind of strength. Not loud, not reactive, but controlled. You respond instead of react. You choose instead of default. And that consistency builds something deeper than confidence. It builds reliability within yourself. You no longer depend on motivation. You do not wait for the right feeling. You act based on decision, not emotion. And that shifts your entire relationship with fear. Fear can still appear, but it no longer disrupts your direction. It becomes background, not command. And as this discipline strengthens, it begins to shape how you see yourself, not as someone who struggles with fear, but as someone who can stand in front of it without losing control. The identity of someone who masters their own mind. At a certain point, this stops being about techniques, strategies, or isolated decisions. It becomes about identity. Not what you do occasionally, but who you are consistently. Because the way you see yourself determines how you respond before you even think about it. If you see yourself as someone who struggles with fear, every situation becomes a test. Every challenge feels like a risk to your self-image. And under pressure, you will unconsciously act in ways that confirm that identity. You hesitate, you doubt, you retreat. Not because you have to, but because it aligns with who you believe you are. But when that identity begins to shift, everything changes at a deeper level. You stop asking whether you feel ready. You stop waiting for certainty. You stop measuring your actions based on comfort. Instead, you operate from a different premise. You are someone who moves forward regardless of internal resistance. Someone who observes fear without submitting to it. Someone who acts with intention, even when the outcome is unknown. This identity is not built through affirmation. It is built through evidence repeated over time. Every moment you choose action over avoidance, every time you hold your ground instead of retreating, every instance where you remain steady under pressure, you reinforce a new version of yourself. And that version becomes more stable with repetition. Eventually, your default response changes. You no longer need to convince yourself to act. It becomes natural. Fear may still appear, but it no longer defines your behavior. It becomes something you experience, not something you obey. This is where real freedom begins. Not the absence of discomfort, but independence from it. You begin to trust your decisions more. You rely less on external validation. You move with clarity, not because everything is certain, but because you are grounded internally. And that grounding creates a sense of direction that is not easily shaken. People often look for confidence as a feeling, but at this stage, confidence is no longer a feeling. It is a pattern, a way of operating that remains consistent even when emotions fluctuate. And once this identity is established, the role of fear changes completely. It no longer stands in front of you as an obstacle. It stands beside you as a signal, something you can acknowledge without losing your path. Which leads to the final shift, the point where fear stops occupying space and something else takes its place entirely. When fear loses space and clarity takes control, there comes a point where fear no longer dominates your internal landscape. Not because it disappeared, but because it lost its position. It is no longer at the center of your attention, no longer the force that shapes your perception, your decisions, or your direction. Clarity takes that place. Clarity is not the absence of uncertainty. It is the ability to see without distortion, to understand what is real, what is imagined, and what actually requires your response. It allows you to separate sensation from meaning, thought from truth, possibility from probability. When clarity is present, fear becomes smaller, not weaker in intensity, but reduced in influence. It can still arise, it can still be felt, but it no longer spreads across your entire mind. It does not take over your focus. It does not dictate your actions. You begin to experience situations as they are, not as your mind exaggerates them to be. Challenges remain challenges, but they are no longer inflated into threats. Uncertainty remains uncertainty, but it is no longer interpreted as danger. And this shift changes how you move through life. You act with precision instead of hesitation. You decide with awareness instead of urgency. You face situations directly instead of circling around them. Not because you are fearless, but because fear is no longer in control of your interpretation. This is where everything aligns. Your thoughts, your actions, your perception. There is less internal noise, less contradiction, less resistance. Your mind becomes a tool instead of a source of conflict. And with that, a deeper realization settles in. You were never trying to eliminate fear. You were learning to stop giving it authority. Because fear only expands when it is followed without question. It only controls when it is mistaken for truth. And the moment you see it clearly, without distortion, without automatic reaction, it loses the space it once occupied. What remains is not emptiness, but direction. A steady, grounded awareness that allows you to move forward regardless of what you feel. And that is the real shift. Not becoming fearless, but becoming someone who no longer needs fear to disappear in order to act.